What's going on, guys? My name is Bart Komar, and today we're going to be pouring some concrete pads. We're going to be pouring a dry pour and also a wet pour. So we are going through a renovation right now. We're finally at the HVAC stage where we need to have pads for air conditioners. And I don't like hanging anything off of the house, and I don't like the plastic pads because I've already had a couple of them fail on me. So concrete is the way to go. And I've never done a dry pour before, and this is a good opportunity to test it and see how it holds up versus a wet pour. I did pour a couple of sample slabs that we're gonna cut open later in this video and actually reveal the inside to take a look at the difference. Let's get started. Welcome to the Komar Project.
There it is.
All right, guys, because these are going to be small pads, about 40 by 40 inches, we can pre-build the forms before we do any of the site prep work. And I know it's a little bit backwards, but this is going to help with the placement of the pads later on. I don't have to measure anything out on the site. I could just place the pad right where I want it and move on. After cutting a couple 2x4s to size, we took them outside and screwing them together with 3-inch screws. And I like using screws over double head concrete form nails because pretty much everyone has 3-inch screws in their shop, and it's much easier to make adjustments with screws versus the nails. All right, so with our forms all done, we need to actually prep the area that we're gonna be putting the pads onto. And this used to be our area where, we had some landscaping, and all this is mulch with a fabric underneath it to prevent weeds from growing. And with it being fall, there's a whole lot of leaves and also construction debris from when we're working on the house. So I wanna make sure that the area where the two pads are gonna go is nice and clean, and then we can get down to the actual substrate. All right, so now we're gonna start digging, and I'm not gonna go very deep because we're gonna be putting down gravel as well. So I wanna do at least 4 inches of gravel. And depending on where you live, you may not need to do gravel. Here in Chicago, we get a ton of rain, so a little bit of drainage and to have a good base is key. So yeah, digging. After removing about 30 years of packed mulch, I finally got down to solid ground. And because I disturbed it with my shovel, I needed to pack it back down with a hand hammer. When prepping for a concrete pour, you always want to make sure that your base is as stable as possible. Because if the ground that you're building on is not stable, then eventually your slab is going to fail too. Next, I can put 4 inches of 1-inch gravel that we had left over from when we poured our sidewalk and place the form on top of it and got ready to secure it in place. All right, so we got a little bit of gravel in here. I compacted it down just to make sure everything is nice and tight on the bottom. Next, what we have to do is actually bring this up because I want it to be sitting above our grade, which is fairly high. And what we're gonna be using are just some 2x2s that I cut a 45-degree angle on it, and we're gonna raise this to the exact height that we want. With the form secure and ready for concrete, I can cut the tops of the stakes even with the form so that when I'm screeding it, they're not in the way and I'm not hitting it with that 2x4 as we go along it. All right, so this is a new product that I just came across, and this is a fiberglass rebar. Typically when I do projects like this, I always put steel rebar, and you have to cut it with a grinder. It's heavy, it makes your hands super dirty, and it rusts if you leave it outside
for a while, it's gonna rust. Not with this stuff. This is not sponsored whatsoever. I just think it's really cool because you can cut it with a regular circular saw.
Even though this is a relatively small slab and it might not need rebar, I still like to put it in, or at least wire, in all my flat concrete work projects. I had a contractor once talk me out of placing rebar in around our pool because they're using fiber reinforced concrete. And as much as I didn't want to do it, I was really curious about how it holds up and opted not to put the rebar in. And sure enough, it cracked within a couple of months. So now I rebar pretty much everything and I haven't had a crack since. Alright, so now we're ready to start pouring the pads, and I'm going to be starting with the dry pour pad first. I first saturated the form and the base with water and started dumping the dry mix into the form. This is 4,000 PSA concrete that I picked up at my local hardware store for about $5 per bag. And the wet and dry took 8 60-pound bags each. This is the first time that I noticed something that I was not expecting. I thought because we're adding quite a bit more water to the wet pour that it would take less concrete mix, but that was not the case, so they both took 8 bags each. Once I had about half of the form filled, I started screeding it with a 2x4. Working it in sections like this makes it a lot easier to not overfill the form and makes the screeding process a little bit easier so you don't have to push all that concrete all at once. Now, one thing that I did notice is that the dry screeding process will have a lot more rocks that come up to the surface than the dry pour. You can either remove it or you can just push them down back into the form and screed again. And after I ran it through a couple of times, it looked something like this. Then I wanted to put an edge on it with a edging trowel so that it wouldn't have any sharp corners, and that's fairly easy to do. I did have to run the trowel back and forth a couple of times to get it right, but if you ever put an edge on a regular concrete slab, it's pretty much the same process. Then with a float trowel, I could smooth the entire pad as best as I can, and I'm not the best concrete finisher, and this was definitely a little different feeling than working with a wet pour. But we got it smooth enough for the AC pad, and we can move on to misting it with water.
All right, so I got it as smooth as I possibly could. I don't think it can get any smoother without me actually messing it up. So next we're gonna give it a quick mist. And I think the first mist is by far the most important because all you're trying to do is kind of get it to set into place. So a very, very light mist will do. And then we can come back every 30, 45 minutes and give it some more water. All right, for that first mist, that's pretty much it. We don't want to saturate this thing because you got to remember that it's loose under there, right? So what this is doing is just kind of keeping it in its shape, allowing it to harden just a little bit on the top. And then as we go throughout the day, we're going to saturate it more and more and more. But for that first one, we just want to change that color. That's it.
When misting, you want to set your water to the lightest mist setting possible and just get it slightly wet. And to keep it consistent, I set a 45-minute alarm on my phone to make sure that I don't over or under mist it for those first few times. And you can see how quickly that concrete actually pulls that water in. As soon as it goes on, it's pretty much pulled into that mix and it's gone. And your initial thought will be that it needs a lot more water. But for those first couple of times, you just want to mist it as little as possible just for that pad to change color. The next day, however, we're going to be adding quite a bit more water.
All right, so last night it actually rained, and it's a good thing that I had this thing covered because it would have been completely saturated and probably would have ruined this thing. So I did get 4 mists on top of it last night. Today I'm gonna mist it a couple more times, and then we're gonna start working on our wet pour. And before I actually start pouring this one, I wanna make sure that it's still level because it did rain and things can settle and sink a little bit with the wet ground. So I want to make sure that everything's still good before I pour. All right, we're still good. Let's go. All right, so it's been about 45 minutes and starting to set up. And before it actually gets really hard, I want to put an edge on it first, because if you let it get to a certain point, you won't be able to do this.
With both the wet and the dry pour pads set and curing, I started working on the sample pieces that we're going to be cutting open a little bit later. These are 12-inch by 12-inch forms that I'm going to go through the same exact process with the preparation of them as our AC pads. The dry got the same amount of mist and the wet got the same finish as well. Then I can set them off to the side and left them outside so they can go through the same curing cycle as our large pads.
All right, so our two pads are cured. At least I think the dry one is cured. So today we're gonna take them out of their forms, set the air conditioners, and then we can jump over to our test samples and see what they truly look like. This is the wet pour, and it looks pretty good. We're gonna backfill it a little bit so you don't see this bottom edge down here, but other than that, I'm pretty happy with it. Hey, not bad. All right, at first glance, it does not look bad. It looks like it's cured all the way down, but to be truly sure, let's cut open those test samples. All right, let's do this. I am so curious as to whether or not these have cured all the way through. I have my suspicions, but we got our wet pour and our dry pour, and let's just cut into it and see what happens. All right, so we just cut these open, and I have not looked inside yet because I want to talk about the cutting. The dry pour was way easier to cut than the wet pour. For the wet pour, it probably took me twice as long to cut it right down the middle versus the dry pour. So that kind of talks about to the curing or the strength of it. So let's take a look inside and see what they look like. All right, so just like I expected, the wet pour turned out solid all the way through. There's nothing in here that indicates that it would be not cured all the way through and that it would crack at some point. There are no cracks that are visible in here, and it looks pretty good, just like you would expect a regular wet pour slab to look like when you cut it open. You see the rocks that are in the cement mix completely encased in here, and there are no voids around them that I can tell, other than little tiny air bubbles, which again you would expect from a wet pour. But this, just like any other pour, it's great. You could be sure that it's going to hold whatever it is you're putting on top of it without having any issues. Now let's move on to the dry pour, because I really want to look at that. This is very interesting because it seems like it has cured all the way through. Now, maybe the corners are not as strong because there are a couple pieces where rocks are coming out, they're not encased. You can break it up a little bit, but from the looks of it, it is pretty solid right here. Obviously, the only other way to know if it's fully cured is to do a strength test, and we're gonna be doing that in another video. But the only difference that I can see is the color variation and obviously the corner chipping. When I was cutting, there were a couple of areas that were chipping out. These rocks were popping out. So maybe they are not fully cured and encased in the concrete. But from the looks of it, it does look like it has cured all the way through. I'm just extremely concerned now for its strength capabilities because of the chipping. We're gonna try something. We're gonna do a little hammer test on it and see if there's any difference in the chipping. Because if it's chipping on this and it looks like it may be cured all the way through, except for the edges, and I have no idea why that's chipping, so maybe the hammer test will give us a little bit more information. Okay, so on the wet pour, there has been no difference. And on the dry pour, you can hear it. You can hear the difference, as this seems more like a concrete that you would typically run into. And this has a little bit of a duller sound. Let me see if I can get my mic up in here more. Totally different. Now let's hit it with the sharp edge and see what happens. All right, as I expected, the wet pour concrete has a tiny little chips that came off of the sharp edge of the hammer, obviously expected. On the dry pour, you could see chunks that have been taken out of here. And I wasn't hitting hard on either one of these, but you can tell that on the dry pour concrete, there's a lot more damage. And there you go, another piece just fell out, probably from the vibration that came off of the hammer into this concrete. So I guess the proof is in the pudding or in the concrete. The wet pour, there are a few little tiny indentations from the hammer, as you would expect, but the dry pour concrete completely fell apart. So at the beginning, it just made a few indentations, but as soon as I put a little bit more power behind that hammer, it started coming apart, and you can see that it's crumbling in my hand. So after 90 days, it did not cure all the way through. Or maybe it did, and the strength of it just isn't what a regular mix would be. So what does that mean? Well, for any kind of a structural pad, I would definitely not go with a dry pour technique. With the wet pour, you know what you're getting. It's not gonna crack on you, hopefully. But with the dry technique, there's just not enough evidence out there. The manufacturers of concrete don't recommend it, and doing a dry pour just for the ease of installation is probably not worth it. If you're doing a small pad like me, just mix that concrete. If you're doing something big, get a truck with concrete pre-mixed already, and that way you have a little peace of mind that your concrete slab's not gonna crack because it's not cured all the way. Now, this air conditioner is sitting on a dry pour pad, and I think it's gonna be okay because we're not anchoring anything into it. If you're building a structure and you wanna anchor it, definitely don't use this technique because the anchoring bolts that go in there, they spread out and they can even further crack that slab if it's not cured all the way through. So hopefully that gave you guys some ideas on the wet and the dry pour. If you want to learn more about it, make sure you guys are subscribed and hit the bell notification, because the next video, we're going to be taking these samples and putting them into a 10-ton press, and we're going to try to crack them and break them. And we're going to record the pounds per square inch and see which one is actually stronger. I think we both know which one is the stronger one, but for sake of science, we're going to break some stuff. So thank you so much for joining me on this experience. I hope you guys had a good time. I know I did, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Shoot, shoot, shoot. Ah. Ooh. There it is. There it is, Antoine.
That's the one.
What do you think?
It's a monster.
Is it?
I'm gonna need some help from you,
I got you. I got
All
you.
right.